My ethnography is titled Poverty Delivered, Predatory Inclusion in the Rent-to-Own Industry. I worked as a delivery driver at a rent-to-own business for 3 years. For those unaware, rent-to-own businesses offer customers high-end electronics, appliances, and furniture on a contract where the customer receives the product immediately, often with a small down payment, and usually pays a weekly fee until the contract is up and the customer owns the product. Now, it's important to note customers must return the merchandise if they do not make all the payments, and this is even if they made 99 out of 100 payments. Now, although the rent-to-own industry does have a relatively modest beginning, it is no longer a small industry. There are now roughly 5 million rent-to-own customers nationally, and the industry generates about $8 billion in revenue annually. Some of the biggest rent-to-own stores nationally are Rent-A-Center and Aaron's, but I worked for a much smaller chain that had 4 stores, primarily located in Idaho. Although rent-to-own customers have a wide variety of products to choose from, including everyday necessities for contemporary life here in the US, like beds, couches, refrigerators, washers, dryers, and stoves, these items are on the same showroom floor as more lavish everyday items for contemporary living. At the rent-to-own chain where I worked at in Idaho, which is certainly emblematic of the larger industry, every store was covered wall-to-wall with extravagant big-screen televisions, stereos, laptops, and gaming systems, which surround all the other items. The store where I worked at even had luxury purses from brands like Gucci and Prada. Most of the customers from this rent-to-own chain in Idaho initially come in to fulfill a need, but often end up leaving with unnecessary luxuries as well. Nonetheless, while working there for 3 years at this rent-to-own chain in Idaho, I made 388 deliveries and participated in 157 repossessions. So repossession was very common, mainly because of the high interest charged for these items, making it difficult for most people to keep up with the payments. So for example, the average interest rate on products of the rent-to-own chain I worked for averaged 400% above the retail price on all items if the customer fulfilled the rent-to-own weekly contract, which was the most common kind of contract. And TVs are the second most rented item at this chain and nationally, were on average 800% above the retail price. So for a lot of customers, especially those on tight budgets, they eventually had to return the merchandise or have it repossessed. In a previous study I published in the Public Sociology Journal Context, I used thick description stories, interviews with management, pictures, and extensive financial records to explain how rent-to-owns target low-wage workers and people with disabilities with high-interest contracts, overextend their credit, pile on fees, and deliver unsustainable debt, often creating a rent confiscation cycle. After 3 years of collecting and analyzing ethnographic data, I found this rent confiscation cycle contributed to the rent-to-own industry's perpetuation of poverty in the Treasure Valley of Idaho. This perpetuation of poverty happens through what sociologists Seamster and Charron-Chénier call predatory inclusion. Initially associated with loans for education and homes, later added to payday loans, predatory inclusion is when marginalized people are allowed access to goods, services, and opportunities generally associated with the middle class, but the benefits of that access are significantly undermined by the unequal conditions of repayment. For example, on many occasions as a delivery driver for rent-to-own, I witnessed customers returning some of the products from their initial order to reduce their weekly payments. However, what customers sacrificed first often were not luxuries attained from rent-to-own like big-screen televisions, stereos, or gaming systems. Perplexingly, customers repeatedly sacrificed commodities that provided some practical material benefit first, like a washer, a dryer, a bed, or refrigerator, and they would keep their extravagant electronics. Overwhelmingly, the television, which provides little practical benefit beyond immaterial entertainment and requires an additional monthly cost for internet, cable, or satellite services, was often the last item that people were willing to return. However, my consistent experience with customers returning modern necessities and keeping unnecessary luxuries while working at rent-to-own pales in comparison to the driver-manager of this rent-to-own chain in Idaho. We will call him Nick. Nick is an 11-year employee for the chain of stores where I worked, and considering the high employee turnover rate at this rent-to-own chain in Idaho and the entire industry at large, Nick's vast experience with this perplexing phenomenon is rare and invaluable. In an interview, Nick disclosed an encounter that captures how this phenomenon often plays out. As he said, "So we go do a repo. Again, we've overextended this family. They only make so much. They can only pay $100 and they owe $300. So we show up early in the morning. By law, we can't be out at somebody's house before 8 a.m., but we were there about a quarter after. We catch this guy. He's out in his garage hammering down beers. I say, "Hey Chad, we gotta pick up something." So out of the TV, the child's bunk bed, and the refrigerator, he had us pick up the refrigerator and the child's bunk bed. But he kept his large screen TV. And the kid is going, and this is when Nick puts his hand on his head in frustration. The kid is literally freaking out because what's this kid going to sleep on now? He knows his bed is going. He knows the refrigerator's going. I felt really bad, but there was not much I can do about it. That one will stick with me. Nonetheless, some scholars actually argue situations like this are rare in the industry and can be chalked up simply to customers who have less education, quote-unquote, and who are, quote-unquote, irrationally trying to own items instead of merely leasing them through rent-to-own. So I followed up by asking Nick if this was just an isolated incident, and he said, and I quote, "It's not an isolated incident. I mean, I've delivered TVs to places where there's nothing else but the TV or a gaming system. Gaming system and a TV, and there's no place to sit, no dining room table, nothing. The kids are sleeping on the floor, but gotta have that TV, got that PS4 going on." Findings like these have inspired me to look for a deeper explanation of why rent-to-own customers prioritize gratuitous wants over functional life-reproducing goods, rather than simply blaming it on a supposedly quote-unquote uneducated and quote-unquote irrational customer base, as some rent-to-own scholars assert. For instance, rent-to-own undoubtedly facilitates luxurious wants over material needs by the ease and speed at which poor and disadvantaged people can attain various high-end products from their stores. Almost everybody got same-day delivery at the chain I worked for, even if it was for furnishing an entire living room or bedroom set. So this is very enticing to people who could not get this service otherwise. Moreover, the frequency of this phenomenon in Idaho confounds arguments by prominent rent-to-own scholars who assume most customers primarily intend to use rent-to-own quote-unquote rationally as a lease, simply because a small percentage of customers pay the full term of the contract and own the merchandise. For instance, some prominent scholars making this argument attained 10 years of proprietary data from 4 rent-to-own stores, which is the most comprehensive study of rent-to-owns to date. They revealed that 73% of weekly rent-to-own contracts and 52% of monthly payment contracts resulted in return or repossession of goods. Now, these numbers align with Nick's assessment from this Idaho chain, which said that, quote, 30 to 40% of customers fulfilled their contract, end quote. However, unlike scholars from this comprehensive study who assume the high rate of return was because these customers quote-unquote rationally intended to lease the merchandise instead of owning them, I contend that it could just as easily have been the case that most customers initially wanted to own the items, but could not as the high interest on the contract piled up, so they returned the merchandise or had it repossessed. And just as the previous Federal Trade Commission study on rent-owns has shown, more than 2/3 of all customers surveyed from 12,000 family households, they claim they initially intended to own the items. So to presume those who intend to own items by completing a high-interest contract are simply an uneducated minority is sheer conjecture and highly elitist in its assumptions. Furthermore, assuming most customers primarily intend to use rent-own as a lease to quote-unquote try it out before they buy, and not as a sales transaction to eventually own, this conveniently relieves the rent-own industry from any major responsibility, legal or otherwise, for the negative consequences caused by these usurious high-interest contracts. My 3-year experience working at rent-own, extensive qualitative interviews with management, and the myopic and speculative assumptions of some prominent rent-own scholars inspired me to look for a more comprehensive explanation of why luxuries are so heavily prioritized over life-reproducing goods by some rent-own customers in Idaho, amplifying their already compromised financial situations. So, I extended this ethnographic research for my master's thesis by interviewing 19 of the 74 active rent-to-own customers at this rent-to-own chain. I asked them several open-ended questions lasting between an hour and 2 hours to explore why customers participate in such predatory, usurious contracts, and if the historical development of consumer culture and its current embeddedness in the United States has contributed to the rapid growth and success of the rent-to-own industry since the 1990s. I found that rent-to-owns are an ideal fit for Charron-Chénier's predatory inclusion model, every respondent interviewed fits all 4 components of predatory inclusion to varying degrees. I also expanded the boundaries of Charron-Chénier's model by linking it to Thorsten Veblen's theory of pecuniary emulation. Let's start by defining the 4 vital components of predatory inclusion. Number 1, exclusion from the traditional means of acquisition. 2, opportunities for predation. 3, targeting of a vulnerable audience. And 4, initial access followed by long-term problems. Due to time constraints, I will not discuss the 3rd component, which is the targeting of a vulnerable audience. Number 1, exclusion from the traditional means of acquisition. So who are the people most likely to be excluded from the traditional means of acquisition whom the rent-own industry targets? Overwhelmingly, people using rent-owns nationwide are primarily low-income working mothers with children. My participation group of 19 was similar in class and gender demographics, including 15 women, all of whom were mothers, but 7 were single mothers. All 19 respondents claimed to use rent-own only after their credit score took a hit because of issues related and sometimes overlapping to divorce, medical debt, and student debt before choosing to shop at rent-own. These findings strongly indicate that seemingly unrelated debts from divorce, medical debt, and student loans can push more people toward the high-interest contracts of rent-own by excluding them from cheaper financing options for the same items that they cannot afford to pay for with cash. However, the primary method for exclusion from the traditional means of acquisition was low wages. So, for example, every participant claimed to be living paycheck to paycheck, making saving difficult, ultimately pushing them toward the usurious rent-own industry. And as I am sure most of you know, collective wages have remained stagnant in the U.S. since the 1970s, and this is despite huge increases in productivity, forcing a growing number of people in this country to live paycheck to paycheck. For all respondents living paycheck to paycheck, this means that their daily struggle is defined by constantly trying to meet short-term needs and not having the time to pay much attention to the long-term needs, like saving for cheaper options. One example is Heather, a 24-year-old postal worker, a married mother of 5, who got a washer, dryer, couch, and laptop for rent to own. She asserted her inability to save was because basically just working paycheck to paycheck, taking care of kids, it's hard to save for much of anything for us right now, end quote. Moreover, this constant servicing of short-term needs that defines living paycheck to paycheck is further magnified when, as Heather puts it, one's credit sucks balls. In her case, her credit suffered because of unpaid family medical bills and student loan payments. This 1-2 punch of bad credit and living paycheck to paycheck are the primary mechanisms found in the data that excluded everyone interviewed from utilizing a cheaper financing option or purchasing at retail cost. As Heather divulges, honestly, they were all high-dollar purchases, and at the time, we were in a really bad credit situation, so we couldn't buy from a store. We didn't have the credit to go buy from the store, and we didn't have the cash, so the weekly rent-own payments were a good option, or so it seemed at the time. When I asked Heather if she would still use rent-own if she got a raise or had better credit, she said, "Obviously, with most rent-own type things, the products are obviously more expensive than if you just bought outright. If I had the cash, I would just go buy the product outright." Heather's story echoes many of the respondents in which her exclusion from conventional credit markets and lack of savings from living paycheck to paycheck pushed her to pursue rent-to-own as a viable alternative. Furthermore, Heather's story also represents the comments of nearly all respondents who claim they would not shop at rent-to-own if their credit was better or they had the upfront cash. Number 2, opportunities for predation. The most striking finding among the respondents was how their shopping experience at rent-own compared to shopping elsewhere, which allowed them to avoid feeling like a quote-unquote second-class citizen, as one respondent put it. For nearly every respondent, shopping at rent-own is attractive because it makes them not quote-unquote feel poor by facilitating what sociologist Thorsten Veblen called the pecuniary emulation of getting supposedly new, modern products, especially if it means avoiding getting quote-unquote out-of-date and gross used products from secondhand stores. Disgust of secondhand stores was nearly unanimous among the respondents. The irony is that most of the products customers received were used, but the sales manager of the store would often lie and tell the customer they were new and often ask us delivery drivers, did they notice after delivery? Referring to whether they noticed if it wasn't new like he had told them. Repeated examples of pecuniary emulation which came inductively out of the interviews is my novel contribution to the theory of predatory inclusion. Veblen's notion of pecuniary emulation is connected to his most well-known theory of conspicuous consumption. Veblen referred to conspicuous consumption as the upper class's behavior of spending lavishly on unnecessary luxury goods and services to impress others in industrial society. Nonetheless, according to Veblen, the wasteful conspicuous consumption of the upper classes was not the exclusive behavior of the rich. On the contrary, Veblen argued that nearly everyone in industrial societies often implicitly mimic their leisure class's conspicuous consumption habits to boost their self-image as well. Veblen referred to this phenomenon as pecuniary emulation. Shockingly, I found a near unanimous finding of pecuniary emulation among respondents and how the act of shopping itself at rent-to-own, compared to when they shop at big box retailers and traditional furniture stores, makes respondents in various ways and degrees avoid feeling like a quote-unquote lower-class citizen after being excluded from financing cheaper options. For example, Judy, a senior citizen living on Social Security who's been a customer of rent-to-own for over 6 years and had a number of expensive products, she said other big box furniture stores denied her cheaper financing options and wanted immediate payment in full at the time of purchase, and that made her feel like, you just don't have enough class, lady. For respondents like Judy, this belittling feeling of not having enough class to shop elsewhere is relieved when rent-to-own enables their pecuniary emulation through the immediate gratification of quickly acquiring products they cannot get through cheaper means. As Judy explains, I'll be honest with you, I was raised in a good home with a well-to-do mom and dad, and so when I wanted something, I got something, and that's still ongoing. When I want something, I want it now, then I wait and try and figure it out, oh shit, how am I going to pay for that? Judy's pecuniary emulation surprisingly represents most respondents' overall attitudes. This evidence indicates that a big part of rent-to-own's allure is not simply derived from giving those in precarious personal and financial circumstances access to goods and services they otherwise could not afford. Rent-to-own's attraction is also about how it enables pecuniary emulation among marginalized social groups who would be excluded from the broader embedded consumer culture in the U.S. without it. Finally, component 4 of predatory inclusion, long-term problems. All 19 participants explained in elaborate detail how using rent-to-own caused hardships in their lives, including putting off more essential bills like their power bills, constant fear of losing their stuff, being harassed at work and at home when they inevitably got behind on payments, which included additional fees for being late, and an overall feeling of disrespect the longer they were a customer of rent-to-own. Ultimately, most participants regretted ever using rent-to-own. For instance, Melanie, a mother of 4 who works as a full-time caregiver and is a property manager of a trailer park, asserts she has paid probably 15 accounts off through them over the last 3 or 4 years from furniture on down the line, further declaring at one point I was putting over $1,300 a month into their store. Melanie exemplifies how those participants living paycheck to paycheck, who are obviously highly vulnerable to any unforeseen situations that could suddenly threaten their tenuous circumstances, can feel personally slighted when rent-to-own threatens repossession without immediate payment. For example, in Melanie's case, the unexpected shock of COVID-19 caused her to become late with payments to rent-to-own, compounding her anxieties and fears and causing her to feel angry and disrespected when they threaten to repossess without immediate payment. She explains, "So when the pandemic hit, I lost work because I'm a caregiver and I came in contact with COVID. I did not get it, but I work with the highly susceptible ones. I work with the elderly. So therefore, if there's a chance that I've been, close to it, then I have to take the time off in quarantine and all that. And I couldn't make my payments. So I told them, I said, listen, I'm going to be late on this payment. And he told me he was going to come and get my furniture. And I said, if you show up at my doorstep, I'm going to shoot you, plain and simple. I'll just shoot your ass because honestly, I've been with you guys for this long and you can't even give me 5 minutes?" Similar to Melanie, a few other respondents also said that COVID-19 amplified their worries that rent-to-own would repossess quote-unquote their stuff, and every respondent had at least one item repossessed during their time as a customer. This feeling of disrespect after signing the rent-to-own contract, typified by Melanie's story, was expressed by most participants in various ways and became further pronounced for those who were a long-time rent-to-own customer. Lastly, most respondents agreed with Melanie, whose advice to possible first-time customers of rent-to-own was, Don't do it, don't do it. I'm telling you, I'm like struggling to pay all these accounts off into quickness because by the time you pay everything off, you're getting ripped off. The evidence provided by these participants exposes the predatory inclusion of this rent-own chain based in Idaho, and also suggests the need to investigate other rent-own firms as also engaged in predatory inclusion. However, a broader critical examination of the rent-own industry that includes the various ways our embedded consumer culture creates ample opportunities for predation by appealing to this consumerist ideology that makes pecuniary emulation attractive would provide much more meaningful information to policymakers charged with regulating lenders of all kinds. Now, of course, this evidence is, admittedly, only a tiny sample of all rent-owned customers. But it challenges those scholars and lawmakers who assume that if people were more educated and better informed of the long-term cost, they would not use rent-to-own as a sales transaction and only use it to quote-unquote try things out as a lease. My work provides an additional perspective that also indicts the rampant materialism and vanity embedded in the capitalist consumer culture of the U.S. that survives only by constant expansion and growth of profits, mainly through targeted advertisements that is often intended to make us feel anxious and unhappy with who we are and what we have. The findings from this study suggest that for most of these participants, financial literacy is alone insufficient to reduce the effectiveness of rent-own targeting marginalized groups with high-interest contracts because 17 of the 19 respondents claim to be fully aware of the high interest in the rent-own contract before signing. And all respondents claim they intended to eventually own all the items they received from rent-to-own. Of course, more financial education among all Americans and more regulations regarding rent-to-own are desirable, but my findings show that my participants' attraction to rent-to-own is far more complicated. Maybe what is needed, as Martin Luther King Jr. once said, is that we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values, along with forcing corporations to pay their employees better, combined with more education and regulation of the rent-own industry, to effectively avoid such predatory practices by businesses like this in the future, especially against marginalized groups who are made to feel like they must keep up with the Joneses to achieve the American dream, no matter the cost.